The laughter echoed louder than the school bell, but no one noticed the boy's hands trembling under his desk. "Simple answers from a simple mind," the teacher had said, as the class erupted. But by the next morning, the sky would roar louder than their mockery, when a helicopter split the silence above their heads. Who really holds power, the one who teaches, or the one they quietly underestimate? It was supposed to be a routine Tuesday morning in room 14B of Maple Ridge Middle School, where chalk dust still lingered in the air from the math quiz scribbled out before the bell. Mr. Randall, a sharp-tongued educator with a reputation for sarcasm masked as wit, stood at the front of the room. His glasses caught the morning light, throwing a glint across the floor tiles as he called on a student whose name was often passed over, Ethan. The boy's flannel shirt was a size too big, sleeves frayed, his jeans still caked with bits of dry mud from his family's farm. Mr. Randall read the question aloud, an open-ended prompt about how innovation has shaped the modern world. Ethan, caught off guard, gave an honest if overly simple answer. "My dad says working with your hands is still the best kind of progress." A pause. Then came the snicker from the back. And the one from the side. Mr. Randall didn't let the moment pass. He leaned into it. "Yes, well, and your dad probably thinks tractors are a form of cutting-edge technology," he said, letting the sarcasm drip slowly. The class erupted. Ethan stared down at his desk, eyes locked on a pencil nub that had rolled near the edge. His face turned a shade redder with every second, and he didn't say another word. Mr. Randall paced slowly back to the whiteboard, his smirk firm, as if he had taught a valuable lesson in critical thinking. But what he had actually done was far different. He had taught a room full of kids how to mock what they don't understand. As the period wore on, Ethan sat in silence, the sting of embarrassment coating his thoughts. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and certainly not like this. His classmates stole glances, some pitying, others amused, and the giggles resurfaced every time Mr. Randall made another flippant remark. Even the quiet students, the ones who normally avoided the spotlight like Ethan did, weren't immune to the contagious energy of cruelty. The bell finally rang, and Ethan was the first out the door, backpack slung over one shoulder, boots squeaking against the tile as he made a hasty exit. Outside, the sun was shining, but for him, the world felt shadowed. As he walked down the gravel path that separated the school from the rest of town, he kicked at a loose rock and clenched his jaw. Words were hard for Ethan, but feelings, those stuck like thorns under the skin. He didn't cry. He wouldn't give the world that satisfaction. But his silence held weight, and deep within it, a storm was gathering. Meanwhile, inside the staff lounge, Mr. Randall recounted the moment to another teacher with a laugh, brushing it off as just another day taming the barn animals. The other teacher gave a half-hearted chuckle, uneasily stirring her tea, but said nothing. A few overheard fragments of that conversation would reach Ethan's ears by the end of the day. That night, back at the farmhouse, Ethan sat across from his grandfather at the kitchen table. The old man noticed his grandson pushing food around on his plate, barely touching it. His grandfather, known simply as Pop around town, said nothing at first. But after a long pause, he leaned forward and asked softly, "Who tried to make you feel small today, son?" Ethan hesitated, then met his grandfather's eyes. In them, he saw something more than concern. He saw fire. Pop didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. He simply placed a call that evening to someone who owed him a favor, someone who hadn't heard from him in years. And the next day, that favor would arrive in the sky, loud enough to silence a classroom and shake the windows of a school built on pride. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a valley that wore the morning mist like a shawl, hiding secrets the town had long forgotten or willfully ignored. Ethan's home wasn't grand by any means. Paint peeled from the siding, the porch creaked beneath weight, and the gravel driveway forked unevenly around a rusted tractor that hadn't moved in years. But inside, warmth bloomed in every corner, thick with stories, with legacy, with a quiet pride that didn't need to be declared. After dinner, Ethan sat by the hearth while Pop reached behind a cabinet and pulled out a dusty wooden box. The latch clicked open like a secret giving itself away. Inside were faded photographs, yellowing letters, and medals glinting faintly in the dim light. Pop didn't speak in long monologues. His words came slow and deliberate, as if they were being weighed before spoken. He told Ethan about the days before the farm, When he was a young pilot who didn't just fly helicopters, he designed them. Not many people know this, Pop said, but your granddad once sat in rooms with men who moved entire industries. Ethan's eyes widened, the shame of the day shifting to curiosity. In a small photo at the bottom of the box, Pop stood beside a prototype military aircraft, grinning, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. Behind him were officials, engineers, and suits who seemed to blur into the background compared to the steady confidence in Pop's stance. Back then, Pop had been a rising star in aerospace engineering, a mechanical savant with a knack for solving problems no textbook could. He designed components now standard in the military fleet and held patents that quietly accumulated revenue even after he stepped away from the industry. Ethan listened with the focus of someone who needed these truths like water in a drought. He'd always known his grandfather was special, but the world had painted their family as simple country folk, hard-working, yes, but small in every other sense. Pop explained how he had left it all behind after Ethan's grandmother passed, exchanging boardrooms for barn doors and conference calls for rows of corn. They called me a fool, he said, a faint smile ghosting his lips. But I'd never been richer than when I traded their applause for your father's laughter in this kitchen. Pop had chosen a quieter path not out of failure, but because he believed in a life where success wasn't measured by titles or headlines, but by character, legacy, and connection. This legacy, though invisible to Ethan's teachers and classmates, was the very foundation of who he was. Pop's farm wasn't just a patch of soil, it was a hub. Underground, a private airstrip ran alongside a converted hangar where he still kept 2 aircraft in pristine condition. Few in town knew it existed, and even fewer were aware that Pop leased that strip of land to government contractors who stored equipment there in off-seasons. Quietly, Pop was still very much involved in the world he had once dominated. He was still respected in select circles, a mentor called upon during crises, a strategist whose wisdom was whispered about in elite aviation meetings. But he never flaunted it. That kind of noise wasn't his style. Instead, he poured his knowledge into quiet moments with Ethan, fixing a gearbox together, explaining the physics of lift over supper, or building model gliders out of scrap wood. Ethan had never seen these lessons as special, but tonight, with the echoes of laughter and mockery still fresh in his mind, he realized they were gifts far beyond what his classmates could imagine. As the fire crackled and Pop leaned back into his worn recliner, he spoke with a clarity that settled into Ethan's bones. Some people only see the dirt on your boots, not the foundation under it. But you and me, we know better. Ethan nodded slowly, the shame of the classroom melting into something steadier, something rooted. Pop stood up, pulled a top off a crate near the door, and revealed a polished headset and flight jacket. Tomorrow, he said, we're going for a little ride. Ethan's heart leapt, not from fear, but from a feeling he hadn't held since his mother passed. Pride. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stared out the window at the stars, wondering how many people at school could name even one constellation. The next day wouldn't just be about correcting an insult, it would be about revealing the truth, not with anger or vengeance, but with undeniable presence. The boy they had laughed at wasn't just a farmer's son. He was the grandson of a man who once helped the world take flight, and tomorrow, the town would remember that the roots they'd dismissed ran deeper than anyone dared to guess. The sun had barely crested the eastern ridge when Pop was already up, boots laced, jacket zipped, and clipboard in hand. There was something ritualistic in the way he prepped the morning, feeding the chickens, checking the generator near the hangar, tapping a set of coordinates into his weathered satellite tablet. While Ethan rubbed the sleep from his eyes, Pop had already coordinated with a long-retired Air Force colleague to clear a low-altitude pass over the county. The boy watched from the porch as Pop moved with a quiet authority, each motion a whisper of a past life lived in command towers and tarmacs. After breakfast, Pop sat Ethan down and spoke with a calm that carried weight, not rage. There's power in silence, son, but sometimes it's your presence that speaks louder than any words you'll ever need. Ethan nodded, still unsure exactly what would unfold but trusting this man who had once charted skies like others read newspapers. That trust was a seed, now ready to break ground. Pop wasn't looking for revenge, nor was he seeking applause. His motive ran deeper than ego, it was about restoring something that had been quietly stolen in that classroom, a boy's belief in his own worth. Before heading out, Pop opened a locked drawer and handed Ethan a leather folder, worn at the edges and heavy with history. Inside were blueprints, contracts, and commendations addressed to Colonel Elijah Hawthorne, his full name rarely used on the farm. It was there in black and white, proof that this man, covered in dust and flannel, had once advised generals and consulted for defense firms worth billions. Ethan traced the documents with his fingers, each line awakening a new perspective. He hadn't just come from good stock, he came from legacy, from ingenuity wrapped in humility. The day's plan was simple but precise. Pop would fly in just before the third period break, when students flooded the yard and teachers took their lounge coffee. The moment would be unmissable, and yet it would carry no announcement, no fanfare, only arrival. The town was used to crop dusters and the occasional police chopper, but nothing like what was coming. At exactly 10:17 a.m., just as Mr. Randall was preparing his next round of vocabulary flashcards, a low vibration passed through the school's brick foundation. At first, the windows shivered slightly, prompting curious glances toward the glass. Then came the unmistakable whir of rotor blades, deep, rhythmic, and thunderous like a distant drumline rolling over the horizon. Students leapt from their seats toward the windows, faces pressed against the glass, voices rising in overlapping questions. Outside, leaves whipped into frenzied spirals as dust plumed across the sports field. The sleek, angular silhouette of the modified military-grade helicopter hovered into view, its dark paint shimmering in the morning sun. It didn't circle like a news crew. It descended like a falcon with purpose. And inside room 14B, Mr. Randall froze. He stood there, whiteboard marker still in hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His first thought was that some local celebrity had come to film something, but then he saw the school's security officer sprinting out of the office with a walkie in hand. Confusion spread like fire across the school. Phones came out, students screamed, and for the first time all week, Ethan felt no weight on his shoulders, just stillness. He slowly rose from his seat, slung his bag over one shoulder, and walked calmly toward the door without asking permission. Mr. Randall opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His voice had abandoned him. Ethan didn't look back. Down the hall, heads turned. Teachers peered from classrooms. The farmer's son moved like he had every right to be where he was, because he did. The field gate swung open, and as the helicopter's landing skids touched down with precision, its door slid open to reveal a man stepping out in a flight jacket and aviators, posture straight, calm as a sunrise. Pop's boots hit the ground, and the world seemed to pause. No words were exchanged. No grand theatrics played out. He simply nodded toward Ethan, who returned the nod and walked to meet him. From the windows above, dozens of students watched in stunned silence as the boy they'd laughed at the day before shook hands with a man who clearly did not come from obscurity. It was the kind of silence that only awe could create, the sound of minds recalibrating their assumptions in real time. As Pop walked beside Ethan back toward the front of the school, the principal rushed to the field, clipboard flapping in his hand, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping on land. "Colonel Hawthorne," he stammered. Pop turned and offered a gentle handshake. "Elijah's fine. I was hoping to speak to the students for a moment, if you don't mind. Just a quick chat in the auditorium." The principal, wide-eyed and baffled, nodded like a bobblehead. Minutes later, the intercom crackled, and the announcement rang out, "Students and staff, please report to the auditorium for a brief assembly." Inside, the whispers were electric. Who was he? Why was he here? And how did Ethan fit into this? The curtain had barely lifted, and already, the lesson had begun. But this time, it wasn't the teacher doing the teaching. The entire school buzzed like a disturbed hive as the roar of the descending helicopter still echoed off the brick walls and metal lockers. Phones were raised like modern-day torches, capturing the moment for social media, but not a single student could have scripted what came next. Teachers huddled near the faculty lounge, throwing out theories in hushed tones. Was it a drill, a VIP visit, or some military operation? And all the while, Ethan stood beneath the canopy of murmurs, his expression unreadable, a calm sea in the center of a storm he hadn't created but now seemed to command. As he and Pop walked down the hall with the principal leading them, half frantic, half reverent, students parted like the Red Sea, some making way out of sheer curiosity, others out of the sudden, shocking realization that the boy they had laughed at yesterday wasn't just someone, they just hadn't known who. Every step Ethan took toward the auditorium felt heavier than the last, not from nerves, but from the gravity of the moment. Pop's boots tapped a steady rhythm beside him, his face still composed, scanning the walls of the school like a veteran surveying old terrain. When the auditorium doors swung open, a wave of whispers surged like a rising tide. The stage lights buzzed overhead as students filled every seat, elbowing one another and craning necks to get a better look at the mystery guest and his even more mysterious grandson. Some teachers stood near the walls, arms crossed, trying to piece it all together, while Mr. Randall sat frozen in the second row, eyes flicking between Ethan and Pop as if trying to rewrite the events of the past day with new information. The principal shuffled to the microphone, clearing his throat more times than necessary before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest today," he began, eyes darting nervously toward Pop, who remained still, his expression unreadable. "Please welcome Colonel Elijah Hawthorne, retired U.S. Air Force and, well, I'll let him tell it." A polite smattering of applause followed, mostly out of confusion, until Pop stepped forward and, with a slight bow of thanks, took the mic. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried a quiet strength that immediately commanded the room. "Thank you for having me," he began, scanning the sea of faces, most of which were still stuck between awe and disbelief. "I didn't come here today to talk about war stories or achievements. I came here to talk about perception." He let that word hang in the air like smoke. "You see, yesterday, my grandson stood in this building and was humiliated not because he was wrong, but because he was seen as small." A pause. The room went still. But what's small? A paycheck? A zip code? A pair of worn-out boots? He took a step forward. "I spent decades flying missions across the globe, working with some of the brightest minds in aviation, engineering, and defense. And do you know who they reminded me of most? My grandson, Ethan." A wave of heads turned toward the boy, who sat quietly in the front row, shoulders square, face resolute. "Why? Because greatness doesn't shout. It builds. It listens. It gets laughed at before it's understood." Pop continued, recounting stories from his youth, tales of growing up poor and being dismissed by peers, of professors who told him he'd never make it, of colleagues who mocked his accent until they needed his calculations. "Every room I walked into, I walked in knowing I didn't look the part. But I knew my worth. And I want every one of you to understand something," he said, now looking directly at the students. "There's more dignity in driving a tractor with purpose than piloting a jet with ego." A silence deeper than before settled over the auditorium. Even Mr. Randall didn't move. Pop took off his flight jacket, revealing a simple flannel shirt beneath, the same kind Ethan wore, and held it up. "This," he said, "is a uniform too. One of grit. One of integrity. It's not flashy, but it's earned." The message didn't just land, it pierced. Students who had never spoken to Ethan began to realize they'd looked at him and only seen his clothes, not his courage. Pop turned toward the principal and nodded, signaling the end of his talk. But as he stepped off the stage, a student in the back stood up. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the auditorium echoed with the sound of rising bodies and tentative applause that grew into something thunderous, not out of obligation, but out of awakening. Ethan felt heat rise to his face, not from embarrassment this time, but from something unfamiliar. Pride that didn't feel heavy or burdensome, just right. Pop reached his seat, leaned over, and whispered, "You don't need to say a word, son. They see it now." But Ethan didn't stay seated. Slowly, he stood, turned to face the rows of classmates, and nodded once, a simple gesture that said more than any speech could. As he stepped out into the sunlight after the assembly, with Pop beside him, the helicopter still waiting in the distance, it was clear that something had shifted, not just in the way people saw him, but in the way he saw himself. That helicopter hadn't just descended onto a schoolyard, it had landed right on top of every assumption, every whispered insult, every misguided laugh. It was a symbol of truth breaking through ignorance, and Ethan, for the first time, walked taller not because his world had changed, but because now the world finally saw what had always been there. The assembly may have technically ended, but the atmosphere it left behind lingered like the scent of rain after a drought, heavy, stirring, and impossible to ignore. Students filed out in stunned silence, no longer snickering or whispering behind backs. A few offered shy nods to Ethan as he passed, while others stole glances of discomfort at Mr. Randall, whose smug veneer had shattered completely. He sat in his chair, unmoving, arms crossed tightly as if trying to squeeze himself out of existence. His authority, once uncontested in that room, now felt paper-thin. The sting of Elijah Hawthorne's words didn't come from their volume, they hadn't been shouted or theatrical, but from their undeniable truth. It wasn't just a speech. It was a reckoning. In a single, composed delivery, the old man had dismantled decades of condescension that passed as classroom banter, and in doing so, he reframed what strength, value, and leadership actually looked like. Students didn't just hear him, they felt exposed by him, and not in a way that bred shame, but in a way that forced them to question their own quiet cruelties. By lunch, the school halls buzzed with a different kind of energy. Those who had laughed at Ethan the day before now avoided eye contact. Those who had always felt invisible watched him with new admiration. Some students sat in circles, replaying the helicopter's arrival over and over again on their phones, pausing on the moment Pop stepped out like a general descending from myth. But it wasn't the helicopter that had shaken them. It was the realization that someone so grounded could come from someone so revered. In gym class, a few boys who had teased Ethan in the past suddenly asked if he wanted to play on their team. In science, a girl raised her hand and shyly asked Ethan if he could explain how engines worked on helicopters. The boy who'd been mocked for being too simple was now seen as something else entirely, capable, composed, respected. Yet Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't change the way he walked or the way he spoke. He remained who he was, quiet, thoughtful, precise. And that, more than anything, only deepened the impact. Confidence wasn't loud. It was still. It was steady, and it couldn't be taught from a textbook. In the teacher's lounge, the mood was noticeably colder. Several colleagues gave Mr. Randall wide berth, while others exchanged knowing looks over their coffee mugs. The vice principal, a normally timid woman named Ms. Harper, finally broke the silence. "You know," she said, setting her cup down, "I think that boy has more poise than most of us." No one disagreed. Even the janitor, who had been working at the school longer than any current staff, murmured, "His granddad could have run a country if he wanted to. I used to see him fly out every month. Never bragged about a thing." Word spread quickly that Elijah Hawthorne wasn't just a man of influence, he was a man who had chosen simplicity over spotlight, and that made his presence even more powerful. Parents began calling the school office, asking who the guest speaker was. Some requested a copy of the assembly video. A few even asked if he would speak at the town hall. The story had outgrown the school walls, pushing into the wider community with a force no one could contain. That afternoon, the school superintendent arrived unexpectedly, claiming to be in the area for unrelated reasons. But it was clear from the way he pulled the principal aside and walked the halls with furrowed brows that someone higher up had taken notice. The district didn't like surprises, especially not the kind that made headlines. A local news van had already parked near the front gate by the final bell, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy and the man who had appended an entire narrative in under an hour. But neither Ethan nor Pop gave any interviews. They simply walked to the helicopter, climbed aboard, and lifted off like shadows, leaving the ground behind. It wasn't spectacle they were after, it was truth. And truth, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Students stood by the windows again, this time without noise, watching the aircraft disappear into the sunlit sky. It felt like witnessing something sacred. Like watching a myth become real, and then vanish before you could hold on to it. As the school emptied and the staff locked up, Mr. Randall sat alone at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. He had always prided himself on teaching students to think critically, but now he wondered if he'd been using sarcasm as a shield, control as a crutch. He saw Ethan's face in his mind, silent, humiliated, then remembered how that same boy had walked out of the auditorium like a man twice his age. No revenge, no malice, just presence. It gnawed at him. Later that evening, after most of the town had heard some version of the story, Mr. Randall sat on his porch, drink in hand, rewatching a grainy video a student had uploaded to the internet. Pop's words echoed back at him through tinny speakers. There's more dignity in driving a tractor with purpose than piloting a jet with ego. He paused the video, rewound, played it again. Something inside him stirred, something uncomfortable, yet familiar. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the smartest man in the room. And perhaps, he thought, that was the beginning of a new lesson he'd been too proud to learn. The day after the helicopter landed, after the assembly, after the final bell released the last wave of stunned students into the town's dusty streets, the echoes of what had taken place refused to fade. In homerooms and hallways, in locker clusters and lunch tables, the conversation wasn't about gossip or weekend plans. It was about the boy who had walked into school invisible and walked out unforgettable. Something had shifted in the bones of the school itself, as if every brick had been rattled by the truth that the smallest figure in the room may carry the heaviest legacy. Ethan returned the next morning dressed no differently than usual. Same boots, same flannel, same weathered backpack, but this time, eyes didn't dodge him. They met him. With curiosity. With a hint of respect. A few offered quiet greetings. Some nodded. The whispers hadn't disappeared, but they had changed tone. Now they were laden with intrigue instead of mockery. And while Ethan didn't smile or puff his chest, he carried himself with a straighter spine, the weight on his shoulders no longer that of shame, but of belonging. He was no longer the punchline to a joke, he was the line everyone remembered. Inside the faculty room, the tension was more complicated. Mr. Randall arrived early, before the others, placing his lesson plan binder on the table with a kind of mechanical precision that betrayed his spiraling thoughts. He didn't speak much that day. During class, his tone was subdued, his sarcasm muted, replaced with an awkward stiffness he hadn't worn in years. He glanced at Ethan several times, never quite finding the words to approach him. It was as if he were waiting for the right moment to apologize but was terrified he'd waited too long already. For a man so used to control, being powerless in the face of his own misjudgment was a haunting thing. During lunch, he wandered to the staff parking lot, staring at the clouds as if expecting another helicopter to descend and deliver another truth he'd failed to see. But none came. Sometimes, the hardest lessons weren't taught, they were lived. And he, at last, was living one. Meanwhile, Pop stayed away from the attention that had begun to brew in town. He declined interview requests, waved off invitations to speak at veterans groups, and refused to be dragged into any spotlight. Let the message speak for itself, he told Ethan as they worked together in the barn that weekend, replacing rusted parts on an old engine block. People remember stories longer than speeches. And it was true. At the local diner, families murmured about him with a tone that hovered between reverence and guilt. The waitress who once gave Ethan side-eyes when he ordered the cheapest thing on the menu now called him sir without irony. Even the mayor mentioned him in a town meeting, referring to Elijah Hawthorne as a man who reminds us not to confuse wealth with worth. The town had begun to look at its own reflection, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't like what it saw. But in that discomfort, there was growth. Small gestures began to sprout, teachers listening more closely, students defending each other from small cruelties, and parents talking to their children about character in ways they never had before. Still, Ethan didn't let the sudden attention change who he was. He continued helping his father on the farm each evening, waking before dawn on Saturdays to clean out the chicken coops, and studying by lantern light when storms knocked out the power. But there was something different in his gaze now, an awareness, a sense of worth that didn't need external validation. He had seen who he came from. He had seen what people were capable of, both cruel and kind. And he had decided, without needing to say it, that he would carry forward the quiet strength Pop had modeled all his life. That strength wasn't about being loud or flashy. It was about being solid. About standing firm when the world tries to shrink you. About knowing the depth of your roots, even when others only see the dirt. And now, more than ever, he was ready to grow beyond their assumptions. A week after the assembly, Ethan walked into his English class and found Mr. Randall standing at the door, not with his usual clipboard or clipboard jokes, but with something clenched in his hand, a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Ethan silently, then walked to his desk without explanation. Ethan sat down, opened it, and read. It wasn't long. Just a few sentences. I failed you. I saw what I wanted to see and not what was there. I'm sorry. You taught me something I should have already known. Ethan stared at the words for a while, unsure how to feel. He didn't smile. He didn't tear up. He simply folded the paper and placed it in his notebook, letting it live among his notes on theme and tone, where it belonged. Because that apology, that quiet acknowledgement of wrong, was more powerful than any punishment could have been. Back at the farm that evening, Ethan told Pop about it while they were fixing a section of collapsed fencing. Pop didn't stop working, didn't say much, just nodded once and muttered, "That's something." But Ethan knew what he meant. Sometimes, the biggest victories are the quiet ones. The ones that don't make headlines or go viral. The ones that change a man who thought he knew everything into someone willing to relearn the basics. The ones that teach a boy he never needed to be louder, just steady. The ones that prove a name whispered with respect is worth more than one shouted in fear. And so, life returned to its rhythms. School, farm, homework, engines. But beneath it all, a new layer had formed, of respect, of awareness, of truth. The helicopter was gone, but its message hovered still, clear as ever. Never underestimate quiet strength, and never assume you've seen the full story just because you've heard the first chapter.